Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Kurin and Linda Rice Johnson.
Rice, but that's all right. How are you? It's actually Linda Johnson Rice, but that's okay. I'm still the same person. How is everybody? Good, good, good. This is great. Well, this is going to be, I think, hopefully interesting, and I think a lot of fun. I had the pleasure of speaking here and being interviewed last year, and this year I get the real joy of asking a few questions. I think mostly Richard and I are going to have a conversation because we've worked together on a project that is very, it's a passion project, I think, for both of us, and that is the National Museum of African American History and Culture that just opened at the Smithsonian. So we're going to talk a bit about that. I'm not going to do the talking. He's going to do the talking. And we'll ask a few questions. But I think what I really would like to do is just to open it up to Richard. First of all, he wears so many hats at the Smithsonian. It's unbelievable. So I'm going to ask him now, what is your exact title? Because I've known him since 2003, and I don't know how many different titles he's had. And so if you can start from 2003 and then tell us where you are now.
Sure.
That'd be great, because I think we need to give a little background about you.
Yeah, no, it's great. Look, it's great to be here. Great to be here in Rancho Mirage for this great festival, and I'm learning a lot from fellow authors. So I've worked for the Smithsonian for 42 years. Oh, he doesn't look that old. Thank you. But I started for the American Bicentennial in 1976 when we celebrated the 200th anniversary of our country. And since I've known Linda, I've had the title, let's see, Head of National Programs for the Smithsonian, Undersecretary for History and Culture, Undersecretary for History, Culture and Art, Undersecretary for Museums and Research, Acting Provost. Now I'm Ambassador at Large and Distinguished Scholar. And as a few days ago, I'm Acting Director of the Freer and Sackler Galleries of Asian Art.
I'm exhausted.
So
that is wonderful. That is terrific. Well, you were originally from the Bronx.
South Bronx.
South Bronx. Let me be corrected.
South
Bronx and then Queens.
Yeah.
Father was a truck driver.
Yeah.
And your mother was an educator, correct?
She worked in the Garment Center.
Garment Center.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you're at the Smithsonian, so give us a bit of a trajectory, and then you're a cultural anthropologist as well. So how did we get from South Bronx to the Smithsonian?
Well, look, I was a kid growing up in New York City, working class family, first generation American. In New York City, the museums at that time were free. Some still are. And so we didn't have enough, we used to joke, we didn't have enough money to go across the George Washington Bridge to Jersey, but you could walk into any museum in New York. And for me, walking into the American Museum of Natural History, I can walk into that museum and go anywhere in history and anywhere around the world. And that was great, and it was a great opportunity. It gave me a sense of what museums can do, how they can inspire young people, and how they can enable people to aspire. So that influenced me as an undergraduate. I went to India. To go to India, I had a professor who said, you know, maybe you can make some money and you can do some work for a museum. Maybe you can collect. Well, that was a dream for me to collect for the very museum that I had, as a kid, you know, kind of walked in and loved. And so he said, yeah, I work for a lady at that museum, so give her a call and maybe she'll give you some money to work for the museum. I said, who do I call? He said, Margaret Mead. So what did I know?
So you started at the bottom.
I'm 19 years old. I have a conversation with Margaret Mead. I collect I go to India, learn the languages. I realize how ignorant I am, how little I know of that culture. Because I was a kid of New York City. You know that Steinberg poster when you're looking at like 9th and 10th Avenue, and you know, it's a very parochial view of the world from the center of the cosmos. I was like that kid. So I learned a lot, went to graduate school, got a PhD at the University of Chicago, wrote a few books, taught at Johns Hopkins, but came to the Smithsonian pretty soon after, did a few contract gigs for the Smithsonian, and then came permanently.
It's amazing. It's an amazing trajectory.
Well, it's an American story. I mean, it happens, you know, hopefully it happens a zillion times, and it keeps happening.
And so now tell us about the Smithsonian as an institution?
Okay, well, the Smithsonian, everybody's been to the Smithsonian sometime, right? Air and Space Museum, or Natural History, or the Hirshhorn. Okay, so museums on the mall, 19 museums, plus the Smithsonian has the National Zoo. Plus, what a lot of people don't realize is we run telescopes for NASA. We have telescopes in the Atacama Desert, in Greenland, and Hawaii. We run a tropical research center in Panama with 600 people. We do work in 145 countries. And we do everything from tracking disease to saving culture. A lot of work.
A lot.
And Smithsonian Magazine, Smithsonian Channel on TV. So a lot of ancillary business, about a budget of about $1.5 billion, 60% a year, 60% comes from federal government. The other 40% we earn and generate through philanthropy.
And so it's 19 museums.
Yeah.
And the National Zoo as well.
Got to get the pandas pregnant every year.
Okay, that's one job you don't have to do, so that's a good thing. You have to oversee that part. But so as we fast forward a little bit onto the Smithsonian, and what we're really here to talk about is the latest museum to go up. I think it's the greatest, but that's just me because I've worked so much on it and worked so closely with you on it. Yes, of course, absolutely. And so in 2003, we started really on a journey to build the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But I think you really need to go back much further, almost 100 years, to really start to talk about sort of the genesis of that museum.
Yeah, it's an amazing story because back in 1915, for the anniversary of the end of the Civil War, 1865, 1915, there was a great parade of Civil War veterans down Pennsylvania Avenue, as people do, you know, from the Capitol to the White House. African American soldiers who served in the Civil War, some of whom won Congressional Medal of Honors, were not allowed to march. And that was a time, you know, it was heavy duty, Wilson in the White House, you had the birth of a nation, you have a lot of things going on. Rise of the Ku Klux Klan and that level. And so African Americans were purposefully excluded from the history of the United States. And a number of those veterans, quite aged at that point, got together and they said there should be some type of memorial, some type of marker of our service. We risked our lives. Many of us died for this country. And it's not recognized. And so there was a proposal. There was a commission created. It kind of went in and out of favor. Various presidents resurrected it and dropped it. Nobody gave it any funding, and it just languished and languished and languished for almost 100 years.
And so now we sort of really fast forward to 2003. But let's talk about how this museum really came together, because it was a public-private partnership. So we can talk a little bit about that, and then all the things that it took to really put the whole building together.
Yeah, so there were a lot of big questions about this because there was never really a collection. There was certainly a lot of African American history and contributions to the country from art, science, people like Frederick Douglass, again, the whole military history and everything, and it was all overlooked by the Smithsonian. So many people said, well, if you want a museum, we haven't really collected the objects to put in a museum.
Right.
Well, you haven't collected the objects because of, you know, really prejudice and other things going on. There was a fellow known to everybody, I think, John Lewis, congressman from Atlanta, part of the SNCC, the Civil Rights Movement, and he would raise legislatively every year as a member of Congress, and he gets some co-sponsors to put forth a bill that there should be a National Museum of African American History and Culture. And every year, remember Jesse Helms? So Lewis would succeed in the Congress, and then Jesse Helms would always block it in the Senate. And it couldn't go anywhere. And finally, you know, it's one of those kind of unlikely but lovely and wonderful kind of American stories, I think, that happens in our country. You know, the idea is, how do you bring people together over something? So in this case, yeah, John Lewis, who had labored every year to try to make this a reality, and then a guy named Sam Brownback got elected to the Senate from Kansas. Sam Brownback is a very, very conservative guy. And I know him, I've done a few projects with him, but his family came from Kansas, and during the period of the Civil War period, if you remember, there was that term bloody Kansas. There was always the fight over Kansas. Would it be a slave state or a free state? And there were a number of very religious people, and Sam came from such a family of people who believed, very religious background, who believed in the unity of humankind. They believed that we were all made by the same God. And so even though his politics were very different than John Lewis, the idea of recognition, how could you have enslaved a population? How can we dehumanize and treat people like they're not full citizens of the United States? So he joined with John Lewis, and they sponsored legislation. Jesse Helms was out of the way, and this is 2003, and overwhelmingly in both houses in Congress with both parties, it was passed. And then George Bush signed the legislation in 2003, really right off the bat, and again, bipartisan to create that law. So that was a good thing.
Yeah.
The hard thing for you is it created a board. And Linda was the
It created our council. So there is a council that was started in 2003 to really help develop the museum. And the heavy lifting was the fundraising. Was the fundraising, which really fell on the shoulders of the council. And I will say that President Bush was instrumental. I mean, he was so supportive in getting this museum built. And for some people that might have been surprising, but not to us. And his wife, Laura Bush, was on the council and is still on the council immediately. And she went about doing a lot of fundraising for us. So
Linda's very modest here. She was the co-chair of the council and really provided the leadership.
And it has been amazing, but I have to tell you, it's a council made up of, as we go through, I mean, it's Quincy Jones, it's Oprah Winfrey, it's Ken Chenault, who just retired from American Express, who is now our chair. It's Dick Parsons from Time. So these are all type A personalities. But we all came together and worked together because we loved this, we had passion for it, and we wanted to see this succeed. So we did a lot of the heavy lifting because I think in the end, the total cost of the museum was, what, 500 and some odd?
Well, it ended up, we're still getting some of the bills in. It's like when you redo your house and you find out later the contract, oh, I forgot to tell you that, lady, but. So the final tally for this museum is a little north of $600 million.
Yeah.
And Linda and Dick Parsons as co-chairs
I think
of
we
the
stopped.
council.
We left at the 500 million.
Yeah, because it kept changing a bit, and we ran into some difficulties. Again, for any construction project, you start out at a certain amount, and it ends up costing you more. And this cost more because it was on the National Mall of the United States, and we found a river under where we were building a museum and a few other things. So, but in the end, over $600 million. The federal government supplied $270 million.
Right.
So basically, the private fundraising generated, really in the end, for exhibits and other things we were doing in the course, we raised over $400 million. That's a huge amount of money to raise.
Yeah,
it was really amazing.
It was a big lift.
Really amazing. But the board also did, at the beginning, hired a great guy to lead the museum.
Lonnie Bunch. Lonnie Bunch was amazing. Lonnie came from my hometown, from Chicago. He was not originally from Chicago, but he was working in Chicago at the Chicago History Museum. And he came in 2005 as our founding director. And he really was our guiding light and is still our guiding light. And I think it would have been difficult to do this without him.
Yeah, Lonnie had worked, he started out in the Smithsonian, actually at the Air and Space Museum.
He sure did.
And his mentor at the Space Museum was a Tuskegee Airman.
Right.
The only African-American curator at the Smithsonian in the 1970s. And Lonnie worked his way up through American history, became head of curatorial affairs, went back to Chicago, was head of Chicago Historical Society, and was lured back to the Smithsonian for real. When you're building a national museum, you got to realize we have 19 national museums. So, and the country's been around for over 200 years. So this is something that happens like once a generation that you actually get to do. So for a museum person to be able to define how the country is representing this art or representing natural history or air and space or African-American history and culture is the job of a lifetime. And Lonnie did great. He had a... and we had to figure out, you guys worked on the site design where we were going to put it.
Let's talk a little bit about the location.
Yeah.
Because there were several locations proposed, none of which the council wanted. We wanted, and we knew we wanted to be on the mall. And that was no easy feat. It was a lot of lobbying back and forth, a lot of dancing between the council and the political world. But we stuck to what we wanted, and we got it. So I think we are the last museum to be built on the mall.
Yeah, and there was a lot of politics involved. I mean, this might shock you. There's politics in Washington.
It's politics, it's D.C., I don't know.
But the big issue was that last site that Linda talks about was next to the Washington Monument. And so there were some people that said, okay, well, we want this museum to obviously be above ground and high. And then other people said, oh, no, could you put it underground? And it was like that up and down about how high and low it can go and what it should look like. And the style of museums in Washington, as you got a lot of marble and so on, and very white classical buildings. And there was a competition for architects, Norman Foster, and everybody in the world, was part of that architectural competition.
It was an amazing experience.
And then the council and the committee chose.
Well, you were on the jury.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were all sequestered for 3 days. It was probably the most intensive architectural indoctrination I've ever had. But it really was fascinating because, as you said, it was Norman Foster, it was Antoine Predoct, it was Moshe Safdie, it was I.M. Pei's group. So they all presented, and they had amazing, amazing presentations. But in the end, we chose David Ajay. And David is originally from Ghana. And he really understood the true essence and soul of what this museum was going to represent. And not only physically, but obviously culturally as well. And so when he presented, and he actually was the very last one, after the third day, he was the very last one to present. And I think we deliberated a little bit, and in the end, we knew that this was really, he really had it. He had it. And it looks very different than anything else that's on the mall. Very different.
Yeah, he was, David took his inspiration. You see a picture of the
picture
sculpture with the Yoruba sculpture with the crown, right? This crown you see to the outside. And it's like this, right? And kind of an inverted pyramid. Right. And David was inspired by the whole notion of exuberance. Just think of being exuberant.
Right.
And that's a pose in dance, that's a pose in prayer, and so the whole idea of exuberance and uplift.
Everything goes up.
And that was the inspiration for his architecture.
And the cladding on the front, which is, it looks like lattice work, is amazing. It really was from, I think he said this was from, was it from gates that were designed by slaves in South Carolina?
South Carolina and New Orleans, some of the metalwork in New Orleans. And, that cut metalwork, so that would be the outside. So again, this looks very, very different from anything else. And Lonnie would get calls, I would get calls, like, you're building that, you're going to build that museum, it's going to block my view of the Washington Monument, how dare you? And, oh, you're building that museum, it's not white. Really?
No, it's not in many ways. But wait, you have to tell them your biggest fear when we were building the museum.
Okay, so the biggest fear when we were building it, let me skip ahead a little bit. Let me give you a shot and we'll go back to, whoop.
Let's flip back.
Yeah, let me, so we're building that museum. This is what the hole on the mall looks like. Now, you're building a museum next to the Washington Monument. You got to realize, first of all, there's a creek, Tiber Creek, that runs under it. So the water table is only 8 feet. We're building a museum 80 feet down.
80 feet.
So when you're in the bottom of the museum, you're 72 feet below the water. We don't want you to have to snorkel there or something, or scuba dive. So basically, we ended up having to build a bathtub on the mall, which occasioned other cost, and then put the museum in the bathtub and figure out with tubs with pipes and everything how to avoid, hydrostatic pressure and everything else you worry about. But the big one I was worried about is every day I'd come to work from Virginia, Northern Virginia, and I'd look at that Washington Monument. The Washington Monument, there's a bubble of water underneath. This built on a bubble of water underneath the Washington Monument, because that was the banks of the Potomac. And here's a museum like a few hundred yards away, and we're building, and we're pounding in things into the ground, and everything's vibrating. And I'd come in, and I'd be coming down Independence Avenue, I'd look at that Washington Monument and say, is it leaning today? Like I would say, holy, I'm going to really be messed up if we crash the Washington Monument. And I envisioned that hole as like the Washington Monument crashing into the hole of the museum. It would have hampered my career.
Just a little bit, but we got it done.
I'd say it's about less than a quarter mile, probably about 300 yards.
Yeah, it's very close.
It's right there.
It's very close, and actually, it's interesting because part of the museum there's a site design where you can see right to the Washington Monument. So, we took in consideration every piece of every land we could. In designing this. David did a brilliant job. But let's talk about some of the things that are in the museum and how we got them. But first of all, you need to show
well, let me go back.
The train car.
Oh, okay. Well,
since we're talking about digging holes.
Okay. Let me see. So here, this is a shot. I don't know if you can see it. You see a few cranes there, and then you see a white horizontal object being lowered into the museum. So as we're building the museum, you're kind of thinking of where everything's going to go. And we had a train car donated, Pete Clausen and his company, and it was basically, you know, a Jim Crow train car, separate section, right, black and white.
Right.
But it was too big to get in the door of the museum, so we had to put it in before we built the museum. So basically, we had to use 2 cranes, a lot of tons of train, put it in, and build the museum around it. So it's that kind of legit, and you got to put it right in the exact place it's going to go, because once it's in, it's not like, honey,
this
could
is not
you
a
move
moving
the sofa?
exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it just doesn't work like that. But we needed to find, as Linda says, how to, you know, in terms of putting objects into the museum. I just want to show there was a shot here. This is the groundbreaking ceremony. I just want to go on the record. You know, the president came, Laura Bush, everybody else. So there is Linda digging that first, with Laura Bush, digging that first shovelful of dirt. So as a council member, not only did she have to raise the money, she had to actually start digging the hole.
We did. That was amazing.
But, you know, the heart of any museum is its collection.
Right.
And that really, Lonnie went around the country.
Around the world.
A lot of people, around the world. And a lot of people who held stuff had not trusted institutions in the United States to take care of their things. And now that we had this museum, it occasioned an outpouring of people bringing stuff from their basements, from their trunks, from their attics, and saying this needs to belong to the museum. And, you know, we had some poignant objects that we were looking for not only in the United States, but around the world.
Yeah. Lonnie excavated a piece of a slave ship off the coast of Africa, South Africa.
South Africa, a big thing. Our first attempt was to find a slave ship, and, you know, you're not going to find a whole slave ship, but remains. And the first one we had located was the Enrique. We started doing a lot of research. You know, behind building a museum and getting a letter, you got to do all the research.
Right.
So we had located where a slave ship had gone down with enslaved people on it. And there was one off the coast of Cuba. And at that point, Fidel and the Castros, they wanted to know where it was. Right. So they played a little cagey. Right. It didn't work out. But we found another slave ship that had gone down. It was coming from Mozambique. It had gone down off the coast of Cape Town, actually. And we were able to do underwater archaeology and bring up some of those pieces. The reason we knew it was a slave ship, I mean, we found remains of shackles and other things, but we also found these bars that was used as ballast. Right. Because if you were shipping molasses or other things, it was heavy. When you're shipping human beings, you need that iron ballast. And so when you find that ballast at the bottom of the sea, you know there were human beings with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And where it is in the museum, you start on the lower level. And so I think the museum is built in such a way that you start on the lower level, so you start in the dark. You start in the darkness. And you originally start in Africa, where we were African kings and queens. And then we are taken on our middle passage, and that's when you hit the slave ships. And then you take the journey through the rest of the museum. And I always say that it's incredible because you start in the darkness at the very bottom and you work your way up to the top to the light, because that's the brightest is at the very top of the museum. So that's the way it's been designed.
From enslavement to freedom. John Hope Franklin was the head of our scholarly group, wrote a book by that name,
Yep.
and that really inspired it. But we needed the items to tell the stories. So Lonnie, in going around the country, found this slave cabin that was still intact in the Sea Islands off of Georgia. Found posters for recruiting African American soldiers during the Civil War. Harriet Tubman material. Harriet Tubman, her hymnal. She was very inspired by those hymns, and when was leading slaves out of bondage, would sing those hymns to give people spirit. This dress, now you don't know the story of this dress,
I
right?
don't.
Okay.
I don't. I told him to save the story because this is one I didn't
Anybody
know.
idea whose dress this might be? Okay. We actually had her mink coat at the Smithsonian already. Her name was Marion Anderson.
Yeah.
She's the one that Marion Anderson gave the concert at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday, 1939, because she was not allowed to perform in Constitution Hall.
Right.
And Eleanor Roosevelt and others arranged for her to sing out on that memorial. It was a mass gathering, and many people trace, really the energy of a public civil rights movement early to Marion Anderson in that performance. So we had her mink coat. We didn't have the dress. And at that opening ceremony, Denise Graves was doing the Star
Yeah,
Spangled
the other
Banner.
opera singer who's brilliant.
And
Yeah.
was doing this, and we were waiting at the White House afterwards. There was that reception
Yes.
President Obama and Michelle Obama had for us, and we were waiting. And I was standing next to Denise, and she said, "How are you getting stuff for this museum?" I said, "Well, you'll be surprised at what people have." And she gave me one of those looks, and I said, "What do you have?" And she said, "Well, when I was coming up as an opera singer, Marion Anderson took me under her wing. And she gave me some things." I said, "What did she give you?" She said, "She gave me a dress." I said, "Well, I think something has to go." So I got her in touch with Lonnie, and eventually this dress of Marion Anderson came into the collection and was united for the first time in decades with the mink coat that she wore that cold Easter Sunday concert. So some of these things had tremendous stories with it. There's a Tuskegee Flyer, the Tuskegee Airmen. There was a guy in Minnesota, a Navy guy. He was a captain. Him and his wife restored planes. They bought a cheap crop duster. I don't remember whether they bought it at auction or eBay or something, for a few $100s. They were restoring it. They decided, let me just check the serial number on this. They checked the serial number. They find out, holy cow, this was used at Tuskegee to train Tuskegee Airmen, and then they restored it in the Tuskegee Airmen style. Then they started flying. They took Tuskegee Airmen up in it, all the Tuskegee. Their last flight, they went to Tuskegee. They had Tuskegee Airmen sign it, and then they flew it to Washington to the Smithsonian. Great, great stories behind all these objects, and that's what really fills in and fills up the building. But we had to raise the money for the building.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. There is one other object, I guess, that I think we should talk a little bit about, and that is about Emmett Till.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you all know the story of Emmett Till, but Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy who was brutally beaten for allegedly whistling at a white woman. And
In Mississippi.
in Mississippi.
Yeah.
Was horrible. And the pictures of Emmett Till were first published in our publications, in Jet magazine, which my father started, and Ebony magazine. And Lonnie went to, I believe it was Emmett Till's mother at the time.
Yeah,
She's
yes.
since has passed on. And they excavated the coffin. And so we pulled that, And that is an installation in the coffin. There's nothing in it, just so
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
There's nothing in it.
It was very moving.
But the
Linda's-
way
yeah.
that it is cited and the way that it is installed is very moving. And there are places within the museum where we do have signs that say, you know, if you have children under the age of such and such, just be aware and be cautious and be mindful. Because when you walk into that space, and it is set up as if it is his funeral. So it's set up with the church and the pews. And it's, to me, it is one of the most moving exhibitions in the entire museum. And there are wonderful things, and you know, it's not all dark, it's not all slavery, but it's not all light either. And so it's real. It's real. Everything we put in there is real.
That is the most sacred spot, I'd say. And Linda's family in publishing that, there was a lot of controversy over that. Emmett Till was horribly, horribly disfigured by that. And his mother, you know, there was a choice about whether he should have a closed casket or an open casket. And his mother said, no, you keep it open. I want people to know what segregation looks like. I want people to know what this brutality looks like. And, you know, the magazines was, you know, your family made a very courageous decision to publish that, but it really, it was a turning point in people going to that funeral. I mean, you see pictures of that. I mean, people fainting. It was just the horrors of it. It was like when many of us saw, you know, dogs and the fire hoses and people, you know, it was just inhuman. It was just too much. But that was really a turning point. And in the museum, there's always a line to get into the
a very
to that
quiet
section.
line.
Yeah, yeah. It's just you know, you want to sit there and cry.
Yep.
It's very very moving.
Oof. It's in the late 50s.
Late 50s, yeah.
Yeah. It was a horrific incident. But those are the types of things that are in the museum. But you're right. As we get to curating and staffing and all those wonderful things it takes to put a museum together, it does take cash. And so, you know, we've got a few nice big number up there.
Yeah, yeah. That was part of the number. Oprah's she had given us $1 million then, and she was on the board, and then she gave us $12 million. And then you remember we were at a point in the campaign, we were stuck at $192 million.
I remember very well because she actually was not
She was in
she was not in the room. She was not at the council meeting, but she had called in. And and she said, well, you know, we were talking about fundraising and where we were and, you know, thanking people for their gifts. And everybody did a lot of heavy lifting. And she said, but, you know, I really like round numbers, so I'm going to go to 20 million. We were like, oh, okay.
yeah, you've never seen so many corporate, you know, like CEOs just sitting there with their mouths.
Titans of industry were like this.
Like everybody was like,
what do we do now?
You know, and it was, I envisioned her like in her PJs in Montecito
exactly.
or something.
Around the kitchen.
Yeah, something, but why not? So that really provided a spur, and then we moved well beyond there, and people like Robert Smith came in with, many companies came in. Foundations came in.
And actually,
Gates.
I think Oprah ended up with 21 million.
Yeah.
And that's because Robert Smith, who's a wonderful philanthropist, African American philanthropist, came in with 20 million. And so she said, I got to go one more.
Yeah. But people, you know, it was a marvelous. David Rubenstein, who's now the chair of the Board of Regents, gave $10 million. Who regards it as part of patriotic philanthropy to tell the story of the country. And Colin Powell, everybody gave.
Everybody did. But I think what's so important, too, is all of the members that across the country that gave whatever they could, whether it was $25 or $50, everybody, they stepped up to the plate.
Smithsonian doesn't usually get money from
Richard was saying he's never seen a church give anything to the Smithsonian, not cash like this.
Yeah. And here we got $1 million gift. And in the end, we received over 140,000 donations. 140,000 donations to put together that museum. So it was really a marvelous effort, and there's a representation of fundraising of everybody in the shape of the corona of the museum that contributed to it. And then, of course, the museum went up, and there it is in Washington. You can see the proximity to the Washington Monument and the grounds. It's really at a central place. And we had the opening ceremony.
We did. Because remember, we had to raise all this money without having a museum. So it's hard. It's easy for people to, once they see something, to get involved and to want to give. But when you have to really be able to conceptualize what this is going to be, and you really have to understand what the significance of it is. And so we really got a lot behind the scenes before we really came out of the ground with the museum.
The beautiful thing at the opening was that we had
that was a beautiful thing.
Was that a beautiful shot?
Yes, it was.
And George Bush had signed the legislation. Laura Bush came to the board meetings. As Linda said, she helped out. She held teas. She got helped raise money for it. George Bush believed in it very strongly. The Obama administration made sure that we had the appropriations going forward. For the opening ceremony, I mean, it was joyous. It was really joyous, and it came at a time, September 2016, where our country was, really experiencing, going through Ferguson and other things, Baltimore, really experiencing tough times, and things that we thought. And Lonnie has said this to me a few times. Very closely worked together for decades. That, we thought we were dealing with a history museum. History is here with us. History doesn't just go away. And the fact that we're repeating some of the issues of bigotry and intolerance and other things made us say, this museum is not just a bunch of history curators writing a history textbook or putting stuff in cases. This is talking about who we are as Americans. And I'll never forget, George Bush had a really poignant line at that opening ceremony. He said, "No great country is afraid to look at and examine its history." Because lesser countries are the ones that cover it up.
Right.
Who kill off people who are going to tell various narratives. And our country is bigger than that. So it was very joyous between the Obamas and the Bushes. It was really, John Lewis gave an impassioned talk. We had all sorts of performers like Stevie Wonder and others. And in the front row sat, President Clinton was there, and Joe Biden was there, and others, but also Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan.
Right next to each other.
Right next to each other. I'd like to say they were holding hands. I don't know, but it was bipartisan. People, Sam Brownback was. I mean, it was really very much like this is what we want our country to be, and it was.
And I think we should also add that President Trump has been there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the I have actually a shot of. Let me see. We did a program at the Kennedy Center.
Yep.
Which was very moving to me. One of the movies, I don't know what was your favorite of that, but at the Kennedy Center, it was just amazing. The range from Herbie Hancock and jazz to rap music to classical. And at one point, I remember Colin Powell came out with the Tuskegee Airmen and gave them a salute. And again, it was just so moving. Just a quick tour, as Linda has said it. You start out in the slave ship. And slavery, you come out to the promise of the Declaration of Independence. What does it say? All men are created equal.
Right.
And here we have the contradiction that slavery represented. And you go through the museum, and it's really beautiful. It's high columns and, a lot of room and very educational. And we made a mistake at the Smithsonian. I made a mistake. So my mistake was when we're usually doing museums, you're calculating how many people can get in the museum a day. So we figure, we call it technically in the museum world, it's a terrible term, we call it the dwell rate, dwell time. But I mean, how many people average Smithsonian visit 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours. So we figured, okay, 2.5 hours, maybe
think
it'll
about
be 3.
yourself. How long can you really spend in the museum? So it's maybe 2-3 hours. You're kind of tired by then.
So we figured, okay, we'll get about 17,000 people a day in this museum. But what happens in this museum? People stay all day.
All day.
Twice as long. 5.5, 6 hours.
5.5 and 6 hours.
And so it's so we right now there's a tremendous demand on the museum. And then as Linda said, you go up from slavery to freedom, and you get to the culture floors with music and sports and drama and TV and the visual arts, and it's really uplifting. Oh, this is the Emmett Till.
Yeah. Oh, you do have it.
I
Yeah.
have actually from the magazine, not
Yep.
showing the, and the you know, everything from fashion, like my fashionista friend Janetta Cole,
Yes.
her robes from Spelman College, and a lot of educational programs. And so the museum
Yeah,
does
let's
a lot.
talk a little bit
Yeah,
about that
okay.
because I think it's more than just objects. It really is outreach as well. And so obviously this is wonderful for students and for young people of people of all ages, but mostly young people. So let's talk a little bit about what we do on the outreach and for education.
And it's huge. So as you can imagine, I mean, in this country, many kids don't learn history these days. It's amazing. And so the museum has a very, very active program in the schools, working with teachers, doing a lot of teacher training, and sending curriculum really around the country and around the world. The other things we do is we do a lot of teacher training. So teachers then go out and they come back to their classrooms and school systems. We have formal arrangements with other museums and
Right.
other African American and history museums. We lend a lot of objects to other museums so they can borrow our exhibits. Some of our exhibits travel around.
Yeah, let's pause there for one, because I do think it's important for us to say and for you to note that when this museum was undertaken, and there are other African American museums in different cities. Los Angeles has one, Chicago has a great one, and there was a concern that everything was going to go here. And I think what Lonnie did and what you did and what the council agreed to do, and which was absolutely the smart thing, was we partnered with all these museums. So I know the DuSable Museum in Chicago, which is an African American museum in Chicago. We partnered with them, and so we've had exhibitions go there and back and forth. So I think it's important that we really reached out to all these different museums that were African American museums, because at first they are like, well, what about us? And so we wanted to make sure that we had a partnership back and forth.
Yeah, the other thing that we're starting to do more and more is, of course, digital. I mean, we do a lot of web and social media.
Right.
We have a lot of symposium. We publish books and so on. And of course, new technologies allowing all sorts of new things to take place. So, one of the things to do is with our various objects in the museum is start to look at how we could send our objects, not only real objects around the museum, but items like this for teaching purposes. So my wife teaches in the Virginia schools, and she could teach a chapter about slavery in this country, but you read a word. If Mrs. Kurin holds these up in her second grade class, and a kid looks at these and said, "My God, Ms. Kurin, why are they so small?" Well, that's because there was somebody your age who was brought on the middle passage in these things.
So they're slave shackles.
It is so visceral. It's so much more powerful than the written word. This is a 3D copy made out of metal. We can now take the treasures of this museum and literally print them out around the country and around the world and share them much more broadly and much more viscerally than we ever have before. So this museum will get 3 million people a year and a few million people, but using new technologies to reach people with those kind of lessons, object lessons, in a very, very visceral way, we can do that very powerfully now.
It's amazing. All right, I think we are almost out of time, but we're gonna.
Okay.
I love that
we knew,
question.
We knew you'd
We
get
knew
that.
someone was going to ask that.
Yeah, so a lot of people come. This is the New York Knicks, along with a bunch of kids that they brought with
Yeah.
them. So the museum has been very popular. It's running at capacity. We do online. We put up tickets, and then people go online, and about 15 minutes later, the tickets are gone. And we do them for about 2 months in advance.
Right.
It is
2
terrible.
months.
It's very hard. 2
It's
months,
about
yeah.
2 months in advance.
So it's very hard. What we do is we do take the names for groups, because for schools and you know, nursing homes and fraternities and sororities. They can't do it like that. You're not going to do it individually.
Right.
And we've had, you know, 7 school buses pull up from a church group, and, you know, it's going to be hard to. So we do take names on that. At one point, our waiting list for that was over 50,000 groups. That means they have at least one school bus.
Right.
Or at least one bus. So 50,000 times like 40 seats or something, we had a waiting list of over 2 million people to get in. And we kind of whittle that down, and then it grows back up, and we whittle it down, and it grows. So I had a teacher who called me from Atlanta and said, I can't, you know, please, I want to bring my class in April. I said, well, April 2021, 22. So it's very hard. But that's why all the more it makes the educational programs and the outreach programs more important. We do VIP tours and others. The president did want to come in, Trump. He brought over Ben Carson, and in the museum is actually a display about Ben Carson as a neurosurgeon. So again, you know, however one feels about stuff, that this museum has to reach people that obviously are empathetic and agree with its messages. It also has to reach people who don't. It has to reach the broader American public, because that's where the impact of the museum will be felt. And it has to reach that around the world. You know, when we went last year, Davos is happening out. We went to Davos. Lonnie Bunch is at Davos today.
Yeah.
Talking about this museum to the world. People want to know, how do Americans regard this issue about the diversity of our country, respect and tolerance? That's what we're doing. That's what this museum is doing. And thanks to Linda and the council,
thanks to
who
Richard.
really made it happen, we made it happen.
It's been great. Thank you all.